To Ukraine now, which has been waging a counteroffensive against invading Russian forces for just over a month now. The fight back has come at a considerable cost. According to a report by the New York Times, Ukrainian forces lost up to 20% of their frontline military equipment in the first 2 weeks of the campaign. The rate of loss has now slowed along with the pace of the counteroffensive. The Times said Ukraine has managed to retake just 8 out of 96 kilometers along its planned route. This week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged that there had been a pause in operations, which he blamed on a lack of equipment and munitions. I'd like to now welcome Mike Martin, Senior War Studies Fellow at King's College London. Mike Martin, it bears repeating, according to the New York Times, Ukraine lost up to 20% of its heavy equipment during the first 2 weeks of their counteroffensive. That's significant, and you might forgive an observer in concluding the news doesn't bode well for Ukrainian forces.
It is not brilliant news, although I would say two things about it. Firstly, that this is a force-on-force warfare, right, against peers, and so we should expect casualties to be high. Indeed, they have been high throughout this war. And the second thing I'd say is 20% loss in equipment means that 80% of it still remains. And of that 80%, probably about half is unyet committed. So I don't think the story is written yet of the counteroffensive.
Okay, let's continue to dive deep on this. The rate of losses, as we mentioned, has since slowed from that 20% to about 10%. But that's largely because Kyiv changed to a less, let's say, immediately aggressive tactic. Did Ukraine misjudge the risk of their counteroffensive?
I think it's fair to say that they misjudged how effective some of the Russian defenses were. So Russia had a series of trenches, tank obstacles, minefields, and particularly the latter, I think, were more extensive than they understood them to be. And so I think the Ukrainians hoped that with aggression in the first stage, they might be able to puncture through some of those lines of defence. And indeed, they did in one or two areas, but there were further lines of defence. So I think that they misjudged the depth and the strength of the Russian defences.
I mentioned just a moment ago that Ukraine is employing a new strategy. Can you explain a little bit more what this tactic is and what the potential benefits of the strategy might be?
So the Ukrainians have shifted to what is often called a reconnaissance in force. So it's a more deliberate approach where you move units forward until they come into contact with the enemy, so the Russians, and then you use that contact to establish where the Russian artillery is, where the Russian defensive positions are, and then you hit them with your own artillery before repeating and moving on. So it's a much slower, more deliberate strategy.
Aimed, it appears, at wearing the enemy down. We should also mention that the Ukraine so far has taken only 8 kilometers of the 96 kilometers they set out to retake. Do they have the hardware to reach their goal?
Well, I think the nature of warfare is psychological. And the reason that's important is because you'll have periods like what's happening now, which are quite slow, and it seems that nothing is happening. But all of a sudden, the Ukrainians may breach a defensive line or get behind the Russian lines. And then the whole thing in that, the whole Russian forces in that sector could collapse. And we saw that in Kharkiv in September in the north. Once you're through, the whole thing collapses, and then you make huge gains before entering another period of very slow movement. So I don't think we should take what's been happening over the last few months to be indicative of the months going forward.
Got it. That is Mike Martin, Senior War Studies Fellow at King's College London. Many thanks.
Thank you.
In recent developments from Ukraine, Russia's defense ministry says it has shot down several drones attempting to attack the port of Sevastopol on the occupied Crimean Peninsula. The claims could not be verified. Drones have become one of the main weapons of this war. DW correspondent Nick Connolly visited a Ukrainian control station to see how drone warfare is carried out.
One summer rainstorm and life in this maze of Ukrainian trenches looks a lot like World War I. That is, until you turn a corner. We're in a forward command point, just a few hundred meters behind the frontline Ukrainian positions. The soldiers here use eyes in the sky to coordinate artillery and infantry. But they're not the only ones.
There are so many drones now that nothing goes unseen. On both sides. Any movement, any attacks are going to be noticed and countered.
It's possible that we have the advantage in some areas, but it's definitely wrong to underestimate your enemy.
So we just heard a warning signal over the computer systems there. That means that there is a Russian drone overhead. They're just trying to work out if this is a drone that is about to coordinate an artillery attack on the positions where we are here, or whether it just happens to be flying through the airspace above our heads. The kind of high tech that fills the space is not the only early warning system the Ukrainian soldiers have learned to rely on.
The last time a kamikaze drone came our way, none of the soldiers heard it. But the dog heard it. The dog ran for cover in the trench, and the boys realized something was up. This is a dog that never normally hides when there's artillery, but that time he ran. Our boys managed to get to safety, and the drone came down without injuring anybody. That dog, who bites everyone, saved their lives. He's called Cake.
When you step away from all the screens, you realize that this control room is just a shipping container buried in a trench, albeit one with satellite internet connection and round-the-clock power from a generator. His men are watching in real time as Ukrainian artillery, guided by their drones, takes aim at Russian armoured vehicles many kilometers away.
Do you see? The shell came in nearby, just behind them to the left. They're turning around to get away. It was really close. We almost got them.
With so many drones in the sky, keeping anything on the battlefield a secret has become almost impossible. Any progress there is slow and painstaking.